I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the trash can. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, warm, the kind of day a mother remembers for the rest of her life. But when I walked into the reception hall at the Lakeside Grand Ballroom and looked for my seat, I found something that made the entire room feel suddenly colder. Where my chair should have been, there was a small silver trash can placed neatly beside the table, polished enough that the overhead lights reflected off the metal like a quiet spotlight. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe the staff hadn't finished setting the table. Maybe someone had moved things around during the ceremony. I stood there for a moment holding my purse, scanning the place cards arranged around the round white tablecloth. My son Daniel's new wife, Brittany, was laughing with a group of bridesmaids a few feet away. When she noticed me standing there, she tilted her head and said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, "Oh, Margaret, don't look so confused. It's just a joke." A few people chuckled politely, the kind of laughter people give when they're not sure if they're supposed to find something funny. Brittany walked over, smiling the same bright smile she'd worn all day. "Relax," she said, gesturing toward the trash can like she had done something clever. "Since you always say you like to keep things clean, we thought this would be perfect." She laughed again. The bridesmaids laughed too. My son didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. Daniel just stood there with his hands in his pockets, glancing between us like he was watching something uncomfortable happen across the street. For a few seconds nobody spoke. I could feel the eyes of the guests sitting at the neighboring tables. Some pretended not to notice. Others looked down at their glasses or fiddled with their silverware. I heard someone whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. 30 years ago, I helped Daniel learn how to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the little ranch house we used to live in outside Cedar Ridge. I remembered how proud he looked the first time he made it down the street without falling. Standing there beside that table, I wondered how that little boy had grown into a man who couldn't even look at his mother when she was being turned into a punchline. Brittany folded her arms like she was waiting for me to laugh along with everyone else. The DJ's music hummed softly from the speakers, and the smell of roast chicken and buttered potatoes drifted from the buffet line. It would have been a beautiful reception if not for that small silver trash can sitting exactly where my chair was supposed to be. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at the place card that read Margaret Whitmore, and then at Brittany's smiling face. After a moment, I gave a small polite smile of my own. "Well," I said calmly, "I suppose every wedding needs a little humor." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Brittany seemed satisfied with the reaction. She turned back toward her friends and started chatting again as if nothing unusual had happened. I moved the trash can slightly to the side and stood quietly near the table while the rest of the reception continued around me. No one offered me a chair. No one asked if I was all right. And in that moment, as the music grew louder and the laughter filled the room, I realized something important. The trash can wasn't the joke. I was. I stayed silent that night. But silence has a way of giving a person time to think, and over the next 7 days I thought very carefully about what had happened in that ballroom, and about what I would do next. I stayed until the end of the reception, because leaving early would have given Brittany exactly what she wanted. The band played cheerful songs, people clinked glasses, and waiters moved through the ballroom carrying trays of sparkling cider and plates of cake with delicate white frosting. I stood near the same table most of the evening, listening to the laughter and conversation swirl around me like I was standing just outside of a warm house on a cold night. Every now and then someone would glance in my direction and quickly look away, the way people do when they are not sure whether kindness or silence is the safer choice. My son Daniel spent most of the night greeting relatives, shaking hands, and posing for photographs with Brittany. In every picture I saw them take, Brittany leaned slightly toward him as if the two of them were a perfectly matched pair in a magazine advertisement. Once or twice Daniel looked over at me from across the room. Our eyes met for a second, and each time he gave a small uncertain nod before turning back to whatever conversation was happening in front of him. I wondered if he remembered the nights I spent sitting at the kitchen table helping him finish his homework when he was 10 years old, or the afternoons I waited in the parking lot outside his baseball practice with a thermos of hot chocolate during cold autumn evenings. Mothers carry those memories like quiet photographs tucked into the back pocket of the heart, even when everyone else forgets they were ever taken. Later that evening, Brittany passed by me while talking to one of her friends. She glanced down at the trash can still sitting beside the table and smiled with obvious satisfaction. "See," she said lightly, loud enough for me to hear. "Everybody loves a good sense of humor." Her friend laughed politely, and they continued walking toward the dance floor where the lights had turned soft and golden. I simply folded my hands over my purse and watched them go. By the time the reception ended, most of the guests were tired but cheerful, gathering coats and exchanging warm goodbyes near the tall glass doors that opened to the parking lot. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine from the trees surrounding the lake beside the venue. I walked slowly to my car, a dark blue sedan that Daniel had once helped me pick out at the dealership 5 years earlier when my old car finally gave up after 200,000 miles. As I sat behind the steering wheel, the ballroom lights glowing in the rearview mirror, I felt something shift quietly inside me. It was not anger. It was not sadness either. It was something calmer than both of those things, something steady that comes only when a person finally understands the shape of the truth in front of them. The drive home took about 20 minutes along the familiar 2-lane road that wound through the quiet neighborhoods outside Cedar Ridge. Streetlights passed overhead one by one as the tires hummed softly against the asphalt. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light I had left on earlier still glowed warmly against the white siding of the house Daniel grew up in. For more than 30 years, this place had been filled with birthday cakes, school projects, family dinners, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet darkness of the car. Inside the house, everything would be exactly where I left it that morning. The kitchen clean, the living room lamp glowing softly beside the armchair where I liked to read. The silence did not feel lonely. It felt clear. I stepped out of the car, walked up the front steps, and unlocked the door. As I closed it behind me, I realized something else about that evening at the ballroom. The trash can had been meant as a message. Brittany believed it told me exactly where I belonged. What she did not understand was that messages can travel in more than one direction, and sometimes the quietest response takes the longest to arrive. I woke up the next morning at 6:30, the same time I had woken up for most of my adult life, long before retirement made alarms unnecessary. The sunlight was just beginning to filter through the pale curtains in the kitchen, casting quiet squares of light across the wooden floor that Daniel and I installed together almost 15 years earlier during a long weekend project that left both of us sore but proud. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, listening to the soft click as the burner lit. Morning routines have a way of steadying the mind. Coffee, toast, the sound of the neighborhood slowly waking up. Outside my kitchen window, a pair of robins hopped across the lawn, pecking at the grass with patient determination. The world did not know anything about what had happened at the wedding reception the night before, and in that moment I was grateful for the ordinary calm of a new day. As I poured my coffee into the same white mug I had used for years, I began replaying small moments from the reception in my mind. Not the trash can itself. That part was obvious enough. What stayed with me were the details around it. The seating chart near the entrance. The careful way the place cards had been arranged. The quiet glance Brittany gave the bridesmaids before she spoke. Those things told me something important. That moment had not been spontaneous. It had been planned. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the armchair beside the lamp. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock above the fireplace. On the mantel sat several framed photographs from different chapters of my life. One showed Daniel when he was 8 years old, standing proudly beside a crooked snowman we built together in the front yard after a winter storm dropped nearly 12 inches of snow across Cedar Ridge. Another photograph showed him at his high school graduation, wearing a blue gown and smiling wide enough to make his eyes squint. In that picture, his arm was around my shoulders. When I looked at that photo now, I tried to reconcile the young man in the frame with the quiet stranger who had stood across the ballroom floor the night before and said nothing while his mother was turned into a joke. After a while I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where I kept several old storage boxes. Inside the top box were documents that I had not looked at in a long time. Insurance papers, property tax records, and the original deed to the house my late husband Thomas and I purchased more than 3 decades earlier. I spread the papers across the dining room table and studied them carefully while the morning light moved slowly across the room. Ownership, signatures, dates. The language was plain but powerful. A house is not only a building. It is also a story written across years of effort and sacrifice. Thomas used to say that every nail in these walls carried a memory. We saved for nearly 8 years before we were able to buy this place. Back then Daniel was just starting middle school, and the idea of having a home with a small backyard and a maple tree in the front felt like winning the lottery. I ran my fingers gently across the paper and then placed the documents back into their folder. The trash can at the wedding had been meant to show me where I stood in Brittany's version of the family. But sitting there at the dining table that morning, I began to understand something else entirely. Respect can disappear quietly over time, replaced by assumptions people do not even bother to hide anymore. And when that happens, the person being underestimated has a rare advantage. They can see clearly while everyone else is still busy laughing. I spent the rest of that morning moving quietly through the house, the way a person does when they are thinking about something important and do not want to rush the answer. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall while the sunlight climbed higher outside the windows. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped onto the front porch with a cup of coffee and looked out across the small front yard where the maple tree Thomas planted years ago had grown tall enough to shade most of the driveway. A light breeze moved through the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound that always reminded me of summer afternoons when Daniel was a boy playing catch on the lawn. Back then he used to run across the grass, shouting for me to watch him throw the ball faster than the day before. I would sit in a folding chair near the porch steps, applauding every small improvement like it was a championship moment. Children grow quickly, but the memories of those small victories stay clear for decades. I finished my coffee and went back inside, placing the mug in the sink before walking toward the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept a stack of phone numbers and business cards. One card in particular had been sitting there for years, slightly faded at the edges, but still perfectly readable. It belonged to Robert Halstead, the attorney who had helped Thomas and me organize our estate documents shortly before Thomas passed away 7 years earlier. Robert had always been the kind of man who spoke slowly and listened carefully before offering advice. I picked up the card and held it between my fingers for a moment, remembering the quiet afternoon when Thomas insisted we should make sure everything was arranged properly for the future. At the time I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood he had also been thoughtful. I dialed the number printed on the card and listened to the phone ring twice before a calm voice answered on the other end. Robert recognized my name immediately. His tone was warm and respectful in the way professionals sometimes are when they have known a family for many years. I explained that I wanted to review some documents and asked if he might have time to meet later that week. There was a short pause while he checked his schedule. Then he said Thursday morning would be convenient and that I should bring anything related to the house and the original estate paperwork. I thanked him and hung up the phone. The conversation had been brief, but as I placed the card back on the desk, I felt the same quiet clarity I had experienced the night before in the driveway. People often imagine that decisions like these are made in anger or excitement, but that is rarely true. Most important decisions are made in calm rooms during ordinary mornings when a person simply recognizes that the story around them has changed. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up a few groceries from the small market near the post office. The familiar aisles, the smell of fresh bread, the low hum of conversation between neighbors all felt reassuring in their simplicity. No one there knew about the wedding reception or the polished metal trash can that had stood beside the table like a silent message. To everyone else, I was simply Margaret Whitmore, a retired woman buying apples, milk, and a loaf of wheat bread on a quiet weekday afternoon. As I pushed the cart toward the checkout counter, I realized that Brittany had made one very large mistake the night of the reception. She believed humiliation would make me feel small enough to disappear. Instead, it had given me something far more useful. It had given me perspective. And perspective has a way of revealing possibilities that people who are busy laughing never bother to notice. I arrived at Robert Halstead's office on Thursday morning a few minutes before 9. His building stood on the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, the same quiet brick structure where Thomas and I had met him years earlier to sign the original estate documents. The parking lot behind the building held only a few cars, and the air carried the faint smell of fresh coffee drifting from the small bakery across the street. I sat in my car for a moment before stepping out, looking up at the office windows where the sunlight reflected softly against the glass. There was something reassuring about returning to a place connected to careful decisions rather than emotional reactions. Inside, The office looked exactly the way I remembered. The reception desk stood near the entrance with a neat stack of legal folders arranged beside a small vase of white flowers. A quiet instrumental song played somewhere in the background, barely louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Robert greeted me from the hallway with the same calm smile he had always carried, extending his hand as though we had seen each other only a few weeks earlier instead of several years. He led me into his office where tall shelves filled with neatly organized files lined the walls. A wide oak desk sat near the window, and beyond the glass I could see the tops of the maple trees that shaded most of the street. Robert asked how I had been, and I told him that life had been peaceful until recently. I explained the events of the wedding reception slowly and without exaggeration. I described the table, the polished metal trash can, the laughter that followed, and the silence from Daniel. Robert did not interrupt while I spoke. He simply listened with the kind of attention that good attorneys and good doctors both share. When I finished, he folded his hands together on the desk and nodded thoughtfully. Then he opened a folder containing the documents Thomas and I had prepared years earlier. The papers were still exactly as we left them, outlining the ownership of the house, the savings accounts, and the small investment fund Thomas had built carefully over time. Robert turned the pages slowly while explaining that everything remained legally clear and fully in my name. The house belonged to me alone. The trust we created could be modified at any time if I wished to change the future distribution of assets. His words were not dramatic. They were simple and factual, but they carried the quiet weight of possibility. I looked down at the documents resting on the desk and remembered the evenings Thomas spent reviewing those same pages while Daniel worked on school assignments at the kitchen table. Back then we imagined these plans as a way to protect the future of our family. Now I understood that protecting the future sometimes meant adjusting it when circumstances changed. Robert asked a careful question then. He wanted to know if I believed the situation at the wedding was an isolated moment or part of a larger pattern. I thought about the small details I had noticed over the past few years. The canceled invitations, the family photographs where I was absent, the subtle way Brittany spoke about the house as though it already belonged to someone else. I told him that what happened at the reception did not feel new. It felt like the final sentence in a conversation that had been happening quietly for a long time. Robert nodded again, then slid a blank document toward me along with a pen. He explained that I could update the structure of the trust if I wished, directing certain assets toward other purposes or recipients. The decision was entirely mine, and it did not require anger or conflict. It only required clarity. I held the pen for a moment while the room remained silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. Outside the window, a car passed slowly along Maple Avenue. In that quiet office, I realized that Brittany had believed a simple act of humiliation would make me feel powerless. What she did not understand was that power often rests in places people never bother to examine until it is already moving. I signed the document slowly, writing my name in the careful handwriting I had developed during years of balancing household bills and school forms at the kitchen table. The pen moved steadily across the paper, and when I finished, Robert Halstead reviewed the page with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades watching families make decisions about their futures. He placed the document into a folder and explained that the adjustments to the trust would take effect immediately once everything was filed with the proper records. Nothing dramatic would happen overnight. There would be no confrontation, no raised voices, no emotional announcements. The changes would simply exist quietly within the legal structure of the estate, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I thanked him for his time, and as I stood to leave, Robert walked me to the front desk. Before I stepped out the door, he said something that stayed with me during the drive home. He said that the strongest decisions are often the ones made without anger, because anger fades while consequences remain. Outside, the late morning sunlight had grown warmer, and the small bakery across the street had placed fresh pastries in the window display. For a moment, I considered stopping inside for a cinnamon roll, something Thomas and I used to share on Saturdays when we ran errands together in town. Instead, I walked back to my car and drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge. The houses looked the same as they always had. Lawns trimmed neatly, mailboxes standing beside driveways, children's bicycles leaning against garage doors. Life in small towns moves forward with a comfortable rhythm that rarely changes, and I realized that the decision I had just made would not disturb that rhythm at all. The change existed only in paperwork and intention, invisible to everyone except the people who would eventually discover its meaning. When I reached my driveway, I parked beside the maple tree and sat for a moment before going inside. The house felt peaceful in the afternoon light. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of cold water from the refrigerator. As I stood there, I remembered the look Brittany had worn at the wedding reception when she gestured toward the trash can beside the table. She had believed the moment defined my place in the family. In her mind, the joke had already settled the matter. But what she could not see was the difference between public embarrassment and quiet authority. One exists only for a few seconds in a crowded room. The other continues long after the laughter fades. Later that afternoon, I received a short message from Daniel asking if I had made it home safely after the reception. The message was polite but distant, the kind of note people send when they want to acknowledge something uncomfortable without discussing it directly. I replied that I was doing well and hoped the two of them were enjoying their first week of marriage. I kept the message brief and warm. There was no reason to create tension when patience was far more useful. The following days passed calmly. I watered the small garden behind the house, took a walk through the neighborhood park, and spent an afternoon reading beside the living room window. To anyone watching, my life would have appeared completely ordinary. That was exactly how I wanted it to appear. Because sometimes the most important changes happen quietly, during simple afternoons when the person who made the decision has already moved on while everyone else is still assuming the future will unfold exactly the way they expect. The following Monday afternoon, the sky above Cedar Ridge was bright and clear, the kind of quiet autumn day that makes the streets feel calm and unhurried. I had just finished watering the small row of flowers along the back fence when my phone rang inside the kitchen. When I walked in and glanced at the screen, Daniel's name appeared there. I answered with the same steady voice I always used when he called, and he sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. He asked how I had been and said that he and Brittany had finally returned from their short honeymoon trip along the coast. He mentioned the ocean breeze, the small restaurants near the marina, and the photographs they had taken while walking along the boardwalk at sunset. I listened politely, imagining the quiet waves and the rows of boats rocking gently against the docks. When he finished describing the trip, his tone shifted slightly, and he asked if Brittany and he could come by the house later in the week to visit. He said they had not had much time to see family during the busy days surrounding the wedding and thought it would be nice to stop by for dinner. I told him Thursday evening would be perfect and that I would cook something simple. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the counter and stood there for a moment looking around the kitchen. The room had not changed much over the years. The same oak cabinets Thomas installed, the same small round table near the window, and the same wall clock quietly marking the minutes as it had done through countless family meals and conversations. I opened the refrigerator and began planning what I might prepare for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just a roasted chicken with vegetables and the apple pie recipe Daniel always liked when he was younger. Cooking had always helped me think clearly, and as I washed the apples under cool water, I reflected on how predictable human expectations can be. Brittany likely believed the events of the wedding had already settled everything. She had made her point in front of dozens of witnesses. From her perspective, the message had been clear. But people often forget that time continues moving forward after a public moment ends. Quiet days pass, decisions unfold, and the meaning of earlier events slowly changes shape. Later that afternoon, I walked through the living room and paused beside the bookshelf where several photo albums were stored. I pulled one down and opened it to a page showing Daniel at 15 years old, standing proudly beside the first car he ever helped repair with his father. His smile in that picture was open and genuine, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has not yet learned how complicated adulthood can become. I closed the album gently and placed it back on the shelf. By Wednesday evening, the groceries were already in the kitchen, and the house looked exactly the way it always had. The front porch light glowed softly over the driveway, and the maple tree rustled quietly in the evening breeze. Everything appeared ordinary, welcoming, familiar. That was important, because when Daniel and Brittany walked through the door the following night, they would expect the same comfortable visit they had known many times before. They would sit at the same dining table, drink the same tea from the white cups in the cabinet, and talk about the future with the calm confidence of people who believe the path ahead is already theirs. What they did not know was that the future they imagined had quietly shifted several days earlier in a quiet office on Maple Avenue, long before they ever decided to call and ask if they could come for dinner. I spent most of Thursday afternoon in the kitchen, moving through the familiar rhythm of preparing dinner the same way I had done for years. The roasted chicken sat in the oven, slowly filling the house with the warm smell of herbs and butter, while a small pot of potatoes simmered quietly on the stove. Outside the window, the evening light stretched across the backyard, turning the grass a soft golden color as the sun lowered behind the line of trees. The house felt peaceful, almost unchanged, the way it had felt during so many ordinary family evenings when Daniel was younger and Thomas was still alive. At 6:30, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, the front doorbell rang. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and walked calmly through the hallway to open the door. Daniel stood there with the same relaxed posture he had carried since childhood, his jacket draped over one arm. Brittany stood beside him, smiling politely as she stepped forward to give me a quick hug that felt more like a gesture than affection. She complimented the house and said it looked exactly the same as she remembered. I welcomed them inside and led them to the dining room where the table was already set with 3 plates and the same white dishes that had been part of our family dinners for decades. The conversation at first was simple and light. Daniel spoke about the trip along the coast, describing the quiet mornings near the marina and the small cafe where they had breakfast one day while watching the boats leave the harbor. Brittany mentioned the photographs they had posted online and the messages from friends congratulating them on the wedding. I listened and nodded, occasionally asking small questions about the trip while serving the chicken and vegetables onto their plates. The meal passed comfortably enough, the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation filling the room. At one point, Brittany laughed and said that married life already felt exciting and full of plans for the future. She glanced around the dining room while speaking, her eyes lingering briefly on the walls and the large window that overlooked the backyard. When the plates were empty, I carried them into the kitchen and returned with 3 cups of tea, placing them carefully on the table. The evening had grown darker outside, and the porch light cast a soft glow across the driveway through the window. Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked how I had been spending my week since the wedding. I told him about the quiet walks through the neighborhood park, the time I spent tending the garden, and the small errands around town. Brittany listened with a polite expression, then said something that caught my attention. She mentioned that once Daniel and she settled into their routine, they might begin thinking about moving somewhere with a little more space, maybe even a place with a yard like this one. Her voice carried the casual tone of someone imagining possibilities that seemed already within reach. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if the idea had crossed his mind before. I lifted my cup of tea and took a slow sip before setting it back on the table. The room remained calm. The same familiar dining room where Daniel had once practiced spelling words and where Thomas had read the evening newspaper after work. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Then I folded my hands gently together and looked at both of them with the same steady expression I had worn since the moment they arrived. The dinner had gone exactly as expected, and now the quiet part of the evening was finally ready to begin. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair after I set my tea down on the table, and Brittany rested her elbows lightly near her cup as if the conversation was about to turn towards something practical. I could see the quiet expectation in both of their expressions. They believed the evening would move in a predictable direction, the kind of conversation families have when they begin talking about plans and possibilities. I looked at Daniel first, the same way I had looked at him countless times across this table when he was growing up, and I spoke calmly. I told him that I was glad they had come for dinner and that it was nice to hear about their trip along the coast. Then I explained that earlier in the week I had taken some time to review the documents related to the house and the estate plans that Thomas and I created many years ago. Daniel nodded casually at first, clearly assuming the subject was simply part of ordinary conversation. Brittany tilted her head slightly, her eyes attentive in a way that suggested curiosity rather than concern. I continued speaking in the same steady tone I had used all evening. I explained that the house, the savings accounts, and the small investment fund Thomas built were all still exactly where they had always been. Nothing had been lost or damaged, and everything remained secure. Daniel said that was good to hear and reached for his cup of tea. Brittany gave a small approving smile, as though the information confirmed what she had expected. I waited until Daniel set the cup back on the table before I finished the thought. I told them that while reviewing the documents, I realized it was time to make an update to the trust, something Thomas once mentioned could be done whenever circumstances changed. The room grew quiet then. Not tense, just attentive. Daniel looked slightly puzzled and asked what kind of update I meant. I folded my hands gently together and explained that the trust had been adjusted so that the house would eventually be transferred to a local housing charity that helps families who are rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. I added that the investment fund would now be directed toward a scholarship program at the community college nearby, supporting students who needed help paying for their education. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Brittany blinked as if she had misheard something. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression thoughtful but uncertain. I continued in the same calm voice, explaining that the changes would not affect anything immediately. I would continue living in the house exactly as I always had, enjoying the garden and the quiet neighborhood. The only difference was that the future of the property and the funds had been redirected toward people who would truly benefit from them. Brittany shifted slightly in her chair, glancing briefly toward the window and then back at me. Daniel asked when I decided to make the change. I told him that it became clear after the wedding that life sometimes presents moments when a person needs to reconsider what legacy truly means. A house is not just walls and a roof. It represents years of effort, patience, and care. I explained that I wanted that effort to continue helping people rather than becoming a source of misunderstanding within the family. The clock on the wall ticked quietly behind us while the evening air moved gently through the maple tree outside the window. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before nodding slowly. Brittany said nothing. I lifted my cup of tea again and took a small sip, letting the quiet settle naturally around us. The conversation did not need anger or accusations. Everything important had already been said, and for the first time since the wedding reception, I felt the same calm certainty I had felt while signing my name in Robert Halstead's office. Sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is not a loud reaction in a crowded room. Sometimes it is a quiet decision made afterward, one that changes the future long after the laughter has faded.